The Justified Beliefs podcast is meant to be educational, informative, and engaging. Many different opposing religious views and various controversial topics will be discussed on this podcast. This podcast is not meant to belittle or offend anyone or their beliefs. This podcast is meant for a mature audience. If views expressed on this podcast and opinions expressed on this podcast upset you or send you in a downward spiral of anger, I kindly suggest you stop listening. All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back to the Justified Belief podcast. I'm your host, Luca. I'm pleased to announce that I seem to have figured out what was wrong with my microphone, so it'll no longer sound like I'm speaking to you through an empty Campbell's soup can. So I figured it's high time to take the side road back down through Conspiracy Alley. It's been a while, I feel, since we talked about some good old-fashioned government trickery. This is officially part 3 in the series, It's a Conspiracy. Today is all about the Federal Reserve and what it is. And a quick highlight here, if you think the Federal Reserve is an actual government institution, you've fallen prey to the name and to classic U.S. government propaganda. So believe it or not, the Federal Reserve is actually a private entity managed by private member banks. If that's interesting to you, wait till we really start diving into this. I called this episode the first domino because I feel as though this is usually the first tipping point for a lot of folks when they learn about it. When they kind of start to realize their perception is not always their reality, and they kind of start paying more attention to the government institutions around them and how things are. And I want to start this off by saying, I feel a lot of institutions start off with the correct means and motives, even the Federal Reserve. But the way they inevitably work and how they're managed inevitably leads to abuse. It ends up just being used as a tool to propel influential individuals and politicians into the stratosphere in terms of economic status and money, and everybody else just is pretty much dealing with the ramifications of that. So as I was saying, when folks start to realize it, their perception is not always their reality, and they start paying more attention to the government institutions around them and how things are phrased, versus how they actually work. So before we get into this, I would like to thank Joe Castelli for sponsoring this episode and becoming a Justified Belief podcast Patreon member. Thank you for your support, Joe. Now, I want to kick off this episode with a quote from Thomas Jefferson, which I think frames this entire conversation perfectly. And his quote is really an echo from the past of what is happening right now in modern times, and it was definitely forward-thinking and way ahead of his time. So the quote reads like this: "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allowed private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs." So I'm not going to go too far off into the weeds. I want to stay on topic with this, but I find that quote very interesting. A lot of companies now, if you look at homes in certain, high populous areas, a lot of homes are being bought by corporations and then just being rented out. So Jefferson was pretty forward thinking with that statement, and that's gonna slowly become more of an issue than it already is, when companies just start buying up all these houses and they just start blasting rent prices through the roof. But anyway, I digress. So why did Jefferson say this? Well, first, let me walk you guys through what money is. Now, it sounds funny, but I would say 90% Americans don't know what real money is because, it's from a time before some of us were, paying attention. So a long time ago, paper money was referred to as gold and silver notes, or United States notes, or gold and silver certificate. It's different names, all for the same thing. So if you look at your money now, at the top it says Federal Reserve Note, and there's a massive difference between the two. The full verbiage of, let's say, an old school gold or silver certificate back in the day said this certificate, excuse me, this certifies that there is on deposit in the Treasury of the United States of America. Then at the bottom, it would say, the face value. Let's just, for this example, let's say $20. $20 in silver to the bearer on demand. So this certificate was real money. There was a physical precious metal equivalent amount in the US Treasury to the face value of the paper money, and it was serialized, and you can actually trade it into the US Treasury for the metal. That is no longer the case now. So now let's look at our current paper money. It says Federal Reserve Note, the United States of America, $20, or whatever the face value is. So take notice, there's no mention of the U.S. Treasury on the notes now, but instead it's worded Federal Reserve Note versus Treasury of the United States, like on one of the silver or gold notes or certificates. So right now, we literally have monopoly money that's backed by nothing. A Federal Reserve Note is backed by debt and fairy dust and wishing well magic that the U.S. government is good on the declared face value of the printed note. And this is why inflation is so bad. So that's the Cliff Note basics of money. So now let's get into, what is the Federal Reserve, right? So the Federal Reserve is actually a private central bank that's set apart from the U.S. government. And it's not actually officially part of the federal government, even though board members are appointed by the president. The Federal Reserve operates independently of the government itself, and it was intentionally set up that way by Congress in 1913. But the name Federal Reserve is actually a misnomer, and although it was created by an act of Congress in 1913, its powers are actually delegated to the private banking institutions and private member banks. Now, it was starting off with the right idea to make it autonomous and kind of separate from the government, because most countries that have some type of central banking system that is intertwined with the federal government directly inevitably gets abused. But the problem is, all that was really added was just an extra layer for politicians to jump through. It still inevitably gets abused because now that private banking institution uses board members, right? And these board members sit on the Federal Reserve to help govern it, right? They're called governors. Not like state governors, but Federal Reserve governors, okay? So inevitably, these people are still people and are still influenced by political pressures, by money, by favors, this, that, or the other. Votes can be purchased. And this is, and not to go too far off into the weeds, this is inevitably why kind of no government system really works if people are going to not do the right thing, right? Doesn't matter if you're a capitalist, doesn't matter if you're a socialist. It's just, if people inevitably don't do the right thing, it's never going to work out. So anyway, I digress. So again, it's not like the US Treasury. The Federal Reserve generates debt money, okay? So how is this money made? It's literally willed into existence, backed by debt and loaned out to banks for a set interest rate determined by the Federal Reserve. So now, a point of clarification, the Federal Reserve doesn't actually print the physical bills, only the US Treasury does. It's the reason it's printed as a Federal Reserve note is because it's basically an IOU for the US government. And I'll clarify that as we go. So when I say the Federal Reserve makes the money, I don't mean they are printing the physical bills, but they are increasing the balance amount on ledger sheets digitally for member banks and borrowing institutions. So the Treasury Department, in turn, prints the money for physical circulation. So the Federal Reserve makes the money, which is backed by nothing but U.S. debt in the form of IOUs, right? Treasury bonds and things of that things of that nature. Loans it out to the public through the banks, then charges interest on it to be paid back by worthless money. That interest paid back on the borrowed money is considered profit, which per the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Reserve is a not-for-profit entity. So what it does it do with like the profit? Well, it sends it to the U.S. Treasury. But how can there be an intrinsic profit on borrowed money with debt backing? And that's exactly the point. There's this illusion of profit because you can't actually profit off debt-backed money paid with monopoly money backed by additional debt, right? It just doesn't make sense. So the interest and debt deficit just starts compounding over time and is never actually paid back in full. This is also why the US government runs at a deficit right now, because they overborrowed, and why our national debt is so high. Because they've passed the point of no return where they have exceeded borrowing more than what they can pay back. So now it's just completely out of control. So the interest and debt deficit just starts compounding over time, and again is never actually paid back. This is why the government runs at the deficit, right? And this is why things are so bad right now in the economy, because you can't pay debt with more debt, and it just starts catching up to us. And to make it even more wild, this same private institution that issues the money and regulates how much is in circulation makes the rules and laws on how it's borrowed and paid back and at what interest rate. It's pure insanity when you think about it. And when you really start to look into how the Federal Reserve was created, how it operates, it's very murky. So when the government needs money, like let's say for wars, the U.S. Treasury goes to the Federal Reserve and says, hey, I'm the U.S. government. I need to borrow money from you. And because I'm the government, I'll pay it back. Buy these Treasury bonds and securities and private mortgages in exchange for Federal Reserve notes. So the Federal Reserve buys the Treasury bonds. It's also called T-bills. Different names for the same thing. They buy securities, they buy mortgages. Then the U.S. Treasury prints the physical money backed by the debt bond that was purchased, which is our current fiat currency. And this is why it says Federal Reserve note. Loans it to the U.S. government with interest, and then the government spends it as they wish. The government will then pay back what they borrow with interest via GDP money, tax money from American citizens. The government will pay it back with interest. So if that whole thing doesn't make sense to you, then you're paying attention, because basically our entire economy right now is based on debt borrowing that mathematically can never be paid back. It's a literal house of cards waiting to collapse. So just to kind of simplify this, if I need $3,000 to buy a house, I go to my friend Joe and I say, hey, little buddy, we've been friends for a long time. I always pay my debts. Lend me $3,000. I'll give you this IOU bond and pay you back in 3 weeks with 5% interest. So Joe agrees. I give him the bond. He gives me cash. I now need to make $3,150 in 3 weeks to pay Joe back, because of the interest. So I go with the $3,000 Joe gave me. I spend it to buy a house. 2 weeks pass. I need to pay Joe back soon. So I go to my friend Jill. I said, hey, Jill, let me borrow $3,150. I'll pay you back at 5% interest in 3 weeks. She says, sure. I give her an IOU. I get my $3,150. I then go on week 3 and I pay Joe back. But now in 2 weeks, I need to pay $3,307.50 to pay Jill back what I owe her, which includes the promised interest. So I go and I borrow again and again and again and again. And the money owed is just swelling constantly at a compounding rate. I have to keep borrowing to pay back my IOU, and the money used to pay my IOU was already cash backed by the debt security that was already in circulation. So Joe and Jill already had paper currency from purchasing other IOUs, so their paper currency was already backed by a debt promise before they spent it to buy my debt IOU. So the Federal Reserve note in circulation right now, our fiat paper currency, is the IOU. It's a legalized Ponzi scheme. I'm borrowing on a good faith promise with no actual asset to back it up and having to pay and borrow with IOUs. Now, people might argue that debt is the asset, but it's kind of like a hollow asset if you think about it. The concept of borrowing on debt is wild. And it may just be my own ignorance, but borrowing on debt and then paying with basically IOU with monopoly money, right? Because it's backed by debt already. So you're paying with debt, money that is backed by debt to pay for debts that you're incurring. Like it doesn't make sense. It truly doesn't make sense. But it's a way to literally make money out of nothing, right? So reckless overspending from the government and debt-based money is really propelling us into rampant inflation, and our tax money is being squandered to pay for outstanding debt on top of more debt. The responsibility of the debt is sitting squarely on the shoulders of the American people, and there truly does not seem to be an end in sight. It's literally a shell game with money, and to make matters worse, there's no way to borrow yourself out of debt. And again, that is why inflation is so bad. This has been a looming problem for decades since we left the gold standard, but the effects are compounding. So money is literally just numbers on a screen that the Federal Reserve can manipulate on ledger balances via computer keystrokes. The Federal Reserve buys U.S. Treasury bills, and the U.S. Treasury prints the corresponding monetary amount and puts it into circulation, right? And then has to buy the Treasury bills back with interest. And again, the problem is the government has overstretched itself financially and keeps borrowing. Now, one thing I did mention in the beginning was, buying the mortgage-backed securities. Part of this problem is the U.S. is on a fractional reserve banking system, right? So like these member banks like J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, these Federal Reserve member banks, when you go to get a loan, right, the bank doesn't actually have that money that's loanable. They have cash reserves in the bank, but they don't always have the amount of money you're needing, right? Let's say you go and you get an $80,000 loan, right? For a refi. Actually, let's do it like this. You go to get a loan from the bank for a new house, right? $200,000, let's just say. The bank doesn't actually have the $200,000 to give you. What they're doing is they're putting in an order to the Federal Reserve, okay, for that money. So they're borrowing the money from the Federal Reserve. So that money, right, is just numbers on a screen. And once that money goes to you, they give you the interest rate. And the interest rate is set by the Federal Reserve, but then the bank puts their own little bit of interest on it, right? So that's why you hear things like, or that's why you see like the low interest rates, let's say like 9% for a house, but some banks charge 9.5, 9.225, whatever. So the Fed sets the base interest rate of, let's just say 9%. The bank borrows it from them at 9%. Then they loan it out to you for 9.25. So that quarter percentage that you're paying, they get to keep as profit. So I hope you're starting to see like how this is problematic. And now because you basically are borrowing from the Federal Reserve through a proxy or a third party, they can now buy your debt on your mortgage securities that inevitably the U.S. Treasury will pay for and buy back through the T-bills and through the other mortgage securities. And because everything is filtered through the Federal Reserve financially, they inevitably control inflation and deflation, which is something Thomas Jefferson saw early, warned about, and this is part of the reason why we have problems, because it's ripe for abuse. So, and as I've said on the podcast before, take time to train yourself out of what I call material motivation. We've been conditioned to think that happiness is tied to material wealth, but it's not. We've been conditioned to run on this never-ending hamster wheel of buying useless things we don't really need in an effort to grasp at a skewed materialized concept of happiness. But understand something. Happiness is not a feeling, okay? It's a state of mind. Joy is a feeling. Joy is what you feel when you buy something new, and it's temporary. Joy can be bought, and that's why it's temporary and fleeting. But happiness is learned. Happiness is learned, not bought. Now, you may think this is an oversimplified example of the Federal Reserve, but it's not. It's real. It's literally this simple, but it's grown into a complicated financial disaster. The reason I bring up happiness and materialism is because for this monetary system to work, it has to be in constant motion, right? Money in, money out. So don't kill yourself overworking for material things that constantly keep you in debt. It's literally by intentional design. like I said, it's a large scale Ponzi scheme, and it's starting to crumble. I really hope you guys listening take some time to research this stuff further, because it really does open your eyes. Just like I said, even the name Federal Reserve is misleading. That's why it's important to look into things beyond just the name. People see Federal Reserve and they think that it's a government entity governed by the people. It's really not. It's a quasi-governmental institution with the perception that the people can have a say, but it's controlled by the private banking industries, beholden to political interests at the end of the day. And this is part of the reason why it's persisted so long, because people are just unaware of what's going on. And this is common within government. Things are not always as they appear on the surface. You really have to look into it and see things from different points of view and from different perspectives. And again, if you look at the history of why the Federal Reserve was started and kind of, why Nixon took us off the gold standard, it kind of made sense, but, and it's something I don't want to jump too far into just because of time. There were other options, because inevitably what Nixon's idea was, right? And I can't put all the blame on him, but the idea of the Federal Reserve was to keep the economy more stable and to safeguard the US economy. And for a while it was working, but I personally think it was only working because when they started making Federal Reserve currency, we still had actual treasury bills and notes basically propping this whole thing up for a few decades. But now that all of that is gone and we're just strictly on this debt-based fiat currency, things are really starting to take its toll on the economy, and it really does not seem to have to be working out at all. Now, going back to the reason why was because when other countries were buying our when other countries were getting U.S. currency, right, certificates, silver notes, and that sort of thing, other countries were actually coming to reimburse the certificates for physical gold. So at the time, the U.S. had one of the largest gold stockpiles in the world, but other countries were now taking our our silver and gold notes and trading it for the actual precious metal, and it was depleting our reserves, right? So it makes sense why you wouldn't want to do that, but you didn't need. And again, this is just I'm simplifying this. It is, I'm sure the geopolitical ramifications are a lot more complicated, but it just seems like to me you didn't have to go and make the whole Federal Reserve and debt-based currency. You could have just told people we're no longer swapping the treasury bills for real precious metals, which anyway is what ended up happening, paralleling with the Federal Reserve currency. So it just, the more you look into it, the less it makes sense, honestly. And this is, again, why I hope you guys, start paying a little more attention to some of the stuff happening at the federal level and in government, because a lot of it really is just, it starts off with good intentions, I feel like, but inevitably it just gets abused because the bulk of U.S. citizens, we're just not paying attention and we're not watching. And, the ones who do watch get labeled as conspiracy theorists and all this other craziness. But, especially like this is something that's just a Google search away, man. And when you look at how it works, it just does not make sense. But anyway, so that's my rant for this episode. And that's it for today. As always, if you guys have comments or suggestions, send me an email at justifiedbeliefpodcast@gmail.com. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening, and head over to the Patreon for more free content as it becomes available. Thank you all for listening, and God bless you all.